For 50 years, the daily log at St. Jude's Industrial listed 14 boys as runaways. The headmaster claimed they fled together in the dead of winter, stealing their heavy boots and coats. But when a water main burst beneath the assembly hall in 1924, the repair crew discovered the truth. The boys hadn't run anywhere. They were still standing in formation, encased in the concrete foundation. The structural report filed by civil engineer Arthur Penelegon on February 12, 1924, was dry, technical, and entirely devoid of emotion. It described water damage, compromised load-bearing walls, and the necessity of immediate excavation in the basement of St. Jude's Industrial School for indigent boys. The school, a sprawling brick fortress on the edge of the moors, had been shuttered for 3 years, its silence heavy and suffocating. But when a main water line burst beneath the assembly hall during a freeze, the silence was finally broken by the sound of sledgehammers. Arthur stood in the ankle-deep freezing water, watching the breath of the workmen mist in the cold air. The basement was a cavernous space of brick and iron, smelling of wet rot and lime. The only light came from the portable acetylene lamps, which cast long shivering shadows against the peeling walls. The job was supposed to be simple. Break through the concrete slab, locate the ruptured iron pipe, patch it, and pour new cement. It was the kind of work Arthur had done 100 times before. "Ground soft here, sir," the foreman called out, his voice echoing strangely in the damp acoustic of the hall. "Concrete's thin. Shouldn't be this thin under a load-bearing pillar." Arthur waded over, his boots splashing in the murky water. He shone his flashlight into the hole the men had opened. The concrete here wasn't the industrial-grade mixture used in the rest of the foundation. It was different, coarser, hand-mixed, and poured hastily. Beneath the thin crust of stone, there wasn't packed earth or gravel. There was a void. "Open it up," Arthur ordered. "If there's a sinkhole, we need to know the extent of it before the ceiling comes down." The men worked the pry bars, cracking the slab further. The smell that rose up from the cavity wasn't the smell of sewage or gas. It was earthy, dry, and ancient. It smelled like a root cellar that hadn't been opened in decades. Arthur knelt by the jagged edge, aiming his beam into the crawl space. It was a narrow gap, perhaps 3 feet deep, intended for ventilation or drainage, but clearly repurposed. The light cut through the gloom and landed on something that didn't belong in a foundation. Leather. It was a boot. A heavy, hobnailed work boot, the leather cracked and gray with mold, but unmistakably a boot. And it wasn't lying on its side, discarded. It was upright. "Is that ... a worker?" the foreman asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Arthur didn't answer. He moved the light a few inches to the right. Another boot. Then another. Then another. They were lined up. Perfect, military precision. The spacing between each pair was exactly 6 inches. The laces were tied. The leather was worn at the toes, indicating years of hard labor. Arthur felt a cold prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the freezing basement temperature. Debris and trash are random. They scatter. This was deliberate. This was ordered. "Clear the rest of the slab," Arthur said. His voice remained calm, but his grip on the flashlight tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Don't use the hammers. Use your hands. Don't disturb them." It took 2 hours to clear the debris. When they were finished, 14 pairs of boots stood in a straight line in the trench, disappearing into the darkness of the undisturbed concrete. They were small sizes, not men's boots. Boys' boots. And as the dust settled, Arthur realized the most terrifying detail of all. The boots weren't empty. Rising from the ankles, disappearing up into the solid concrete that had been poured over them, were the tibia bones of 14 children. They hadn't been buried. They had been poured into the foundation while they were still standing. The arrival of the local authorities did nothing to dispel the unnatural quiet of the basement. Constable Halloway, A young man who looked ill-equipped for anything more serious than a tavern brawl stood by the door, refusing to step into the water. It was Dr. Silas Vance, the county coroner, who waded into the trench with Arthur. Vance was a man of geometry and silence, wearing a heavy rubber apron over his tweed suit, his movements precise and unhurried. "Hold the light steady, Mr. Peneligon," Vance murmured, kneeling in the mud. The water soaked instantly into his trousers, but he didn't seem to notice. Arthur kept the beam fixed on the third pair of boots. Vance reached out, his gloved fingers brushing the cracked leather. He didn't recoil. He examined the scene not as a tragedy, but as a mechanical problem. He traced the line of the tibia where it vanished into the rough, overhanging concrete. "Calcification is consistent with adolescent males," Vance said, his voice flat. "Malnutrition evident in the bone density. But it is the positioning that is ... anomalous." "They're standing," Arthur said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "How do you pour a concrete floor over 14 standing people without them moving? Without them struggling?" Vance adjusted his spectacles, peering closer at the gap between the boot and the concrete ceiling. "You assume the floor was poured over them. Look at the sedimentation here, around the laces. The concrete didn't flow down. It rose up." Arthur looked. The engineer in him saw what the human in him had refused to acknowledge. The concrete of the foundation, the rough, hand-mixed slurry he had identified earlier, had been poured around their feet first. They had been standing in the wet mix, boots laced tight, while it hardened. Then, only after they were fixed in place, was the floor slab poured above them. "They were anchored," Arthur whispered. "They were planted like fence posts." "And they waited," Vance added. "The setting time for this type of lime-based mixture in a cold basement. It would have taken hours." The implication hung in the damp air, heavier than the stone itself. 14 boys stood in wet cement, waiting for it to harden, knowing that once it set, they would never move again. And they had done it in a straight line. "I need the school records," Vance said, standing up and wiping his gloves on his apron. "If we are to identify them, we need a manifest." Arthur led the way to the administrative office on the ground floor. The room was untouched by the water damage below, preserved in a dusty stasis. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their labels yellowed and curling. It took 20 minutes to find the ledger for the year 1899, the date stamped on the inside of one of the boot tones Vance had examined. Arthur opened the heavy, leather-bound book on the headmaster's desk. Dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon light. He turned the pages, scanning the neat, copperplate handwriting of a bygone era. Attendance, demerits, ration costs. And then, December 18th. The page was different from the others. The ink was darker, the strokes more aggressive. There was no list of daily chores, no notes on lessons. Just a list of 14 names, written in a steady column. Thomas Miller, aged 12. Samuel Hines, aged 11. William Graham, aged 13. Beside the list, stamped in violent red ink that had faded to a rusty brown, was a single word, repeated 14 times. Absconded. "They didn't run away," Arthur said, his finger trembling slightly as it hovered over the names. "The headmaster wrote this. He knew they were in the basement. He wrote runaway while he was waiting for the floor to dry." Arthur sat in the high-backed oak chair of the headmaster's office, the silence of the room pressing against his ears. Down in the basement, the rhythmic clink-clink of the coroner's chisels had begun a delicate excavation of the dead. Here, in the administrative tower, Arthur was excavating the life of the man who had put them there. The headmaster was Reverend Silas Gault. The name was embossed in gold leaf on the spine of every journal on the shelf. Arthur turned back to the ledger, flipping the pages backward from December 18, 1899. He needed to understand the days leading up to the departure. December 10th. Temperature dropping. Coal ration reduced to encourage vigorous industry. Grade 4 assigned to foundation detail. December 12th. Excavation of the North Assembly Hall proceeds. The soil is stubborn. Boys show fatigue. Discipline administered to Miller and Hines for sloth. December 14th. Cement delivery arrived. Grade 4 instructed in mixing ratios. The Lord builds his house on rock. We shall build ours on discipline. Arthur stopped. He looked out the window at the overgrown courtyard. The North Assembly Hall was the room directly above the basement where the bodies were found. The realization was a cold knot in his stomach. The boys hadn't just been buried in the foundation. They had built it. They had dug the trench. They had mixed the mortar. They had carried the very lime and ash that would eventually encase them. He continued reading, his finger tracing the sharp, angular script, December 17th. Insolence. It spreads like rot. Miller speaks of rights. Graham refuses the night shift. There is a cancer in grade 4. It must be excised before it infects the younger wards. The foundation must be set before the frost holds. A lesson is required, a permanent one. Arthur closed his eyes. The clinical nature of the entry was more horrifying than any rage could be. Gault viewed the children not as souls to be saved, but as faulty materials in a construction project. A cancer to be excised. He reached for a manila envelope tucked into the back cover of the ledger. It was brittle, sealed with a wax stamp that had long since cracked. Arthur slid his thumb under the flap and pulled out a single stiff piece of cardstock. It was a photograph. A cabinet card, sepia-toned, but faded to a ghostly gray. The caption on the back read, Grade 4, Autumn 1899. Industry is prayer. There were 20 boys in the picture, arranged in 3 rows on the steps of the school. They wore rough wool tunics and flat caps. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. Standing behind them, looming like a gargoyle in a low frock coat, was Reverend Gault. He held a cane in one hand and a Bible in the other. Arthur scanned the faces, matching them to the names on the list. Thomas Miller, front row, center. A boy with a sharp chin and eyes that burned with a defiance the camera couldn't extinguish. Samuel Hines, to his left, looking terrified, his hands twisting his tunic. William Brown, tall, broad-shouldered, standing protectively behind the smaller ones. Arthur's gaze dropped to their feet. In the photograph, they were all wearing the boots. The heavy, hobnailed leather boots Arthur had just seen protruding from the basement mud. They were oversized, clunky, weighing down their spindly legs. But Arthur noticed something else. In the photograph, there were 20 boys. The ledger listed 14 absconded. That meant 6 boys from grade 4 had remained. 6 boys had watched their classmates vanish. 6 boys had lived in the school, walked on the floorboards above their friends, and grown up with the secret. Arthur flipped the photo over again. Below the caption, in a different, shakier handwriting, perhaps written years later, was a list of the survivors. 5 names were crossed out. Only one remained legible, though the ink was faint. Elias Thorne. Arthur froze. He had seen that name on the gate when he drove in. The name on the rusted mailbox of the small derelict cottage at the edge of the school grounds. The groundskeeper. The groundskeeper's cottage sat on the periphery of the estate, a small, hunchbacked structure of gray stone, almost swallowed by the encroaching heather. The rain had started, a cold, stinging drizzle that turned the afternoon sky the color of a bruised plum. Arthur turned up the collar of his coat and trudged through the mud, the cabinet card tucked safely inside his breast pocket. Elias Thorne was not an old man. The math made him 37, but the figure that opened the door was ruined. He was gaunt, his skin possessing the pallor of a root vegetable pulled too early from the earth. He wore a heavy wool sweater that smelled of peat smoke and damp dog. His eyes, pale and watery, flicked from Arthur's face to the mud on his boots. The water, Elias said. His voice was rust, unused and brittle. I heard the water main go. I knew it would wash the dirt away eventually. May I come in, Mr. Thorne? Arthur asked. Elias stepped back, leaving the door open. The cottage interior was sparse, terrifyingly ordered. A single chair, a table, a cot made with military precision. There was no clutter, no personal effects. It was the room of a man who was still living under inspection. Arthur placed the photograph on the table. Elias didn't look at it. He went to the small iron stove and added a piece of turf, his movements jerky. I found the boots, Elias, Arthur said softly. All 14 pairs. We're getting the bodies out now. Elias stared into the fire. Are they? Were they broken? No, Arthur said. They were standing. That's what I don't understand, Elias. Concrete takes hours to set. It gets hot. It burns. Why did they stand there? Why didn't they climb out? Elias laughed, a dry, cracking sound. Climb out? Into what? The world? He turned, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the stove. You didn't know, Reverend Gault. You didn't know the rules. Tell me. It wasn't concrete when we went in, Elias whispered. It was the test of resolve. That's what he called it. The 14 of them. They were the troublemakers. The ones who wanted extra bread. The ones who whispered at night. Gault marched them down there. He said, if you want to build a new world, you must be the foundation. Elias mimed holding a cane, his knuckles white. He told them to stand in the trench. The trucks poured the slurry. It was cold, wet mud. Gault walked the edge with his cane. He said the first boy to move, the first boy to lift a foot, would be expelled, thrown out onto the moors in the snow without a coat. And the others ... if they moved, they'd get the cane. They were scared of the cane? Arthur asked, incredulous. Scared enough to be buried alive? Not the cane, Elias corrected. They were scared of failing. Thomas Miller ... he was the leader. He looked at Gault and smiled. He wanted to show the old man he couldn't be broken. He stood at attention. The others followed him. They stood there like soldiers. They thought it was a game of wills. Elias looked down at his own feet. He was wearing slippers, but he curled his toes as if remembering the pressure. By the time the lime started to heat up, by the time the chemical burn started, the suction was too strong. You know how deep industrial muck is, Mr. Penelligon. It grabs you. You can't pull a boot out of wet concrete once it's waist deep. Not without unlacing it. Why didn't they unlace them? Elias looked up, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his cheeks. Because Gault was standing right there. And he told them that unlacing their boots was a surrender of their dignity. He told them to stand tall. And they did. They stood tall until the screaming started. And by then, Gault had locked the door. Arthur returned to the school basement with a taste of peat smoke and bile in his throat. The excavation had progressed significantly in the hour he had spent with Elias. The workmen had erected shoring timbers to support the ceiling, creating a tunnel-like structure over the trench. The sound of chisels had stopped. The silence was back, but it was heavier now, charged with a reverence that hadn't been there before. Dr. Vance was standing waist-deep in the trench, stripping off his latex gloves. He looked up as Arthur approached, his face pale beneath the harsh glare of the acetylene lamps. "You spoke to the witness?" Vance asked. "He told me everything," Arthur replied, his voice echoing in the damp space. "He said it was a test of resolve. Gault made them stand there while it was poured. He told them not to move." Vance nodded slowly, as if Arthur had just confirmed a mathematical equation. He gestured to the jagged wall of concrete that had been exposed around the central figure, the boy Arthur assumed was Thomas Miller. "That explains the preservation of the void," Vance said. "The void? Come look." Arthur stepped down into the mud. The workmen had carefully cut away the surrounding slab, leaving a cross-section of the entrapment. The concrete here was dense, high-grade foundation mix. It had hardened tight against the bodies. Because the organic matter, the flesh and clothing had decayed over 25 years, what remained inside the stone was a hollow space, a perfect negative mold of the boy who had stood there. Vance shone his light into the cavity where the boy's left hand would have been. "Look at the texture of the stone," Vance whispered. Arthur leaned in. The concrete had captured every detail of the moment it set. He could see the weave of the coarse wool trousers imprinted in the gray rock. He could see the vertical line of the side seam. And pressed hard against that seam, perfectly preserved in the negative space of the stone, was the impression of a fist. The fingers were curled tight. The thumb was locked over the index finger. It wasn't the hand of someone clawing at the earth or reaching up for help. It was the hand of a soldier standing at attention. The heat would have been excruciating, Vance said clinically. As the lime slaked, the temperature in this trench would have risen to nearly 150 degrees. It would have caused third-degree chemical burns before it even hardened. And yet, he traced the impression of the fist with a metal probe. He didn't flinch. The mold is crisp. No blurring. No struggle marks. Arthur felt the horror washing over him. It was one thing to hear Elias say it. It was another to see the geological proof of it. Thomas Miller had stood still while his skin burned, holding his posture to prove a point to a man who didn't care. He had locked his muscles and refused to give Gault the satisfaction of seeing him break. "It wasn't just discipline," Arthur said, staring at the fossilized evidence of a child's defiance. "It was spite. They died out of spite." "Spite is a powerful anesthetic," Vance murmured. "But it wears off. Eventually, the systemic shock would have taken over. They likely lost consciousness from the pain before the suffocation killed them. But until that moment, they held the line." Arthur looked down the row. 14 hollow spaces in the concrete. 14 negative molds of boys standing straight, immobilized by their own pride and a madman's wager. The basement wasn't a crime scene anymore. It was a monument to a terrifying, tragic stubbornness. "We need to get them out," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "We have to break the molds to get the bones." "Yes," Vance agreed, picking up a heavy mallet. "We have to destroy the evidence of their courage to give them a burial." The sound of the mallets striking the stone molds was a rhythmic, wet thud crack that reverberated through the entire building. It sounded too much like bones breaking. Arthur couldn't watch anymore. He left Dr. Vance and his assistants to their grim dismantling work and climbed the iron spiral staircase that wound up through the spine of the school. He needed to breathe air that didn't taste of lime and old death. He found himself on the 3rd floor in the private sanctuary of Reverend Silas Gault. The door had been forced open years ago by looters, but the room beyond was largely untouched, likely because there was nothing of value to steal. It was a monk's cell of a room, a hard wooden chair, a narrow bed frame, and a massive mahogany desk positioned precisely in the center of the floor. Arthur walked to the desk. The dust here was thick, undisturbed for decades. He looked at the position of the chair. It was bolted to the floor. It faced away from the window, away from the view of the moors. It faced the interior wall. Protruding from that wall, at the exact height of a seated man's ear, was a brass fitting. It was the flared bell of an acoustic speaking tube, a common feature in Victorian institutions for communicating with the servants' quarters or the kitchen. But this one was different. It had no whistle stopper to signal a call. It was permanently open. Arthur leaned in, brushing a cobweb from the rim. He hesitated, then placed his ear against the cold metal. The sound was crystal clear. Clink, thud, crack. He could hear the coroner's team working in the basement 3 floors down. He could hear the scrape of a boot on the wet floor. He could hear Dr. Vance verify a measurement in a low murmur. The acoustics were perfect. The tube had been engineered not for communication, but for surveillance. It was a direct line to the foundation trench. Arthur pulled back, revulsion rising in his throat. Gault hadn't just buried them. He had come up here, sat in this bolted chair, and listened. He looked at the surface of the desk near the tube. The wood was worn down in a specific spot, the varnish rubbed away by the friction of a restless hand. And right beside that worn patch, half buried in the dust, was a small, leather-bound notebook, smaller than the main ledger. A pocket diary? Arthur opened it with trembling fingers. The date was December 18th, 1899. The handwriting was jagged, erratic, written in the dark, perhaps. 10 p.m. The pouring is complete. Silence reigns below. They hold their breath. 11:30 p.m. A sound from the left flank. Miller, I suspect. A whimper. No ... a prayer? He prays not for salvation, but for strength. The arrogance. 1:15 a.m. The lime begins to bite. I hear the shifting of weight. The leather creaking against the setting stone. Stay still, you wretches. Do not mar the work. 3 a.m. Graham is weeping. He calls for his mother. A weakness I predicted. 4:45 a.m. Silence returns. It is heavier now. The foundation is set. They have become the bedrock of this holy house. I have listened to the devil leave them. Gasp, I gasp. Arthur slammed the book shut. The dust flew up in a choking cloud. The monster hadn't just executed them. He had consumed their suffering like a fine wine, documenting every groan as they calcified in the dark. The walk back to the groundskeeper's cottage felt like a descent. The rain had turned into a torrent, hammering against the slate roofs of the school and churning the mud of the courtyard into a black slurry. Arthur clutched the pocket diary inside his coat, feeling its small, hard rectangle against his ribs like a tumor. He found Elias where he had left him, staring into the dying embers of the stove. The man hadn't moved, but the air in the room had changed. It was brittle, charged with the static of a confession waiting to be torn out. Arthur placed the diary on the table. The leather cover was wet with rain. He listened, Arthur said. He didn't shout. The horror was too large for volume. There was a tube in the wall. He sat at his desk and listened to them nigh. He wrote down the times. Elias looked at the book. He didn't recoil. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cover as if testing to see if it was hot. I know, Elias whispered. You knew? Arthur felt a surge of nausea. You knew he was up there taking notes while your friends were screaming? We all knew, Elias said, his voice gaining a sudden, terrifying clarity. We could see the tube on the wall in the assembly hall. We knew it went to his office. He told us it was the ear of God. He said, God is always listening, and so am I. Arthur paced the small room, the floorboards creaking under his wet boots. Why did you stay, Elias? The school closed 3 years ago. You're a free man. Why live in the shadow of this place? Why guard a graveyard? Elias turned his hands over, looking at his palms. They were thick with calluses, the skin etched with dirt that no amount of washing would ever remove. Because I didn't just watch, Mr. Peneligon, Elias said softly. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. What do you mean? Elias looked up, his eyes swimming with a memory so visceral it seemed to darken the room. The concrete trucks, they didn't come that night. The roads were iced over. Gault wouldn't wait. He said the lesson had to be taught while the spirit was rebellious. He held his hands out, fingers splayed. Who do you think mixed the lime? Who do you think wheeled the barrows? Who do you think shoveled the slurry around Thomas Miller's boots while he stared us in the eye? Arthur stopped pacing. A breath left his lungs. You? Grade 4 survivors, Elias nodded, tears spilling over again. Me, Caleb, John, the 6 of us who didn't step forward. Gault gave us the shovels. He said, "If you do not wish to join them in the foundation, you will assist in its laying." So we did. We poured the wet stone around our best friends. I shoveled the mix over William's feet. He looked at me, Mr. Pedaligon. He didn't cry. He just looked at me and said, "Make it smooth, Elias. Make it level." Elias buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the dry, heaving sobs of a man who has been screaming on the inside for 25 years. "That's why I stayed," came the muffled voice from behind the rough hands. "Because I put them there. I packed the mud down. I'm not the groundskeeper, sir. I'm the jailer, if I leave. I'm afraid they might finally wake up." Arthur looked at the man, the boy who had been forced to bury his childhood to survive it. The horror of St. Jude's wasn't just the 14 dead. It was the 6 living ghosts they left behind, tasked with the terrible labor of their own trauma. The extraction of the 14 boys took 3 days. It was a brutal industrial process that seemed to mock the solemnity of death. To free the bodies, the workmen had to use pneumatic drills and cold chisels, shattering the concrete coffins that had held the boys upright for a quarter of a century. The basement, once silent as a cathedral, was now filled with the deafening roar of compressed air and the white choke of silica dust. Arthur stood by the heavy canvas tarps laid out on the dry section of the floor. Dr. Vance received each set of remains as they were brought up from the trench. The order and precision the boys had maintained in life and in death was finally gone. They were now disjointed collections of calcium and rot, organized only by the coroner's numbered tags. "Subject 1, Thomas Miller," Vance announced, placing a small stained femur onto the canvas. The concrete bonded to the fabric of the trousers. We had to chip it away. Arthur looked at the pile of bones that used to be the defiant leader of Grade 4. Stripped of the stone mold, Thomas looked incredibly small. It was easy to forget, amidst the horror of their resolve, that they were structurally just children. "There was an object," Vance said, his voice cutting through the noise of the drills. He held out a metal tray. "Found in the negative space of the right fist, the one we saw earlier." Arthur picked up the object with tweezers. It was a marble. A simple glass shooter, chipped and clouded by time and lime. "Contraband," Arthur whispered. "Toys were forbidden." Gault wrote about confiscating idols of distraction in his journal. He held it tight, Vance noted, wiping his spectacles. Through the pouring, through the burning, through the dying. He didn't drop it. Arthur rolled the cold glass between his fingers. It wasn't just a toy. In a world where they owned nothing, not their coats, not their boots, not even their own labor, this marble was likely the only thing Thomas Miller actually possessed. Holding on to it while the cement rose wasn't just a comfort. It was a final act of ownership. "You can take my life," the gesture said, "but you cannot have my marble." "We found things with the others, too," Vance continued, gesturing to a row of small evidence bags. Arthur walked down the line. With Samuel Hines, a small rusty cogwheel likely stolen from the workshop. With William Graham, a piece of slate pencil worn down to a nub. With the 4th boy, a dried, fossilized crust of bread wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth. They had all died holding something. Small anchors to the world. Tiny secrets kept in clenched fists, hidden from the all-seeing eye of the Reverend and his listening tube. They weren't just standing at attention, Arthur realized, looking at the debris of these small, sad treasures. They were protecting their pockets. If they had moved, if they had flinched, Gault would have searched them. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't endured the torture just to prove they were strong. They had endured it to keep the only things they loved from being taken away. The inquest was held in the damp vestry of the village church, a proceeding that lasted less than 40 minutes. The magistrate, a man whose primary concern appeared to be the preservation of the diocese's reputation, refused to look at the photographs Arthur had taken. He waved away the ledger with the absconded stamps. He struck the term homicide from the record and replaced it with death by misadventure due to structural collapse. There would be no investigation into Reverend Gault, who had died in his bed in 1912, lauded as a pillar of discipline. There would be no charges for the surviving trustees of St. Jude's. The 14 boys were to be buried in a common pauper's grave at the edge of the cemetery, unnamed, unmarked, and forgotten for a second time. Arthur Penelagon refused. He spent his entire savings from the excavation contract, and then some. He commissioned 14 individual pine coffins. He hired a stonecutter to carve 14 small granite markers, not with numbers, but with names. 2 nights before the reinterment, Arthur brought Elias Thorne into the makeshift mortuary he had set up in the school's carriage house. The smell of wet lime was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh pine shavings and rain. The 14 coffins sat on trestles, their lids open. Inside, the bones had been arranged with as much dignity as Dr. Vance could manage, wrapped in clean linen. Elias walked down the row, his cap in his hands. He stopped at the first coffin. Thomas Miller. "He looks so small," Elias whispered. "He seemed like a giant to us when he stood in that trench ... He looked like he could hold up the roof of the world." Arthur reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small evidence bag containing the chipped glass marble. He opened it and tipped the marble into his palm. "I think he should have this back," Arthur said. "He held on to it for 25 years. It belongs to him." Elias took the marble. His rough, concrete-scarred fingers trembled as he placed the glass sphere gently onto the linen sheet, right where Thomas's hand would have been. "They all had something," Elias said, his voice cracking. "They all had a secret. They moved down the line. Into Samuel Hines's coffin went the rusty cogwheel. Into William Graham's went the slate pencil. One by one, the idols of distraction that Gault had hated so much were returned to their owners. These weren't just trinkets. They were the symbols of the boys' refusal to be completely erased. They were the things that made them individuals in a system designed to turn them into bricks. When they reached the end of the row, Elias stood for a long time looking at the empty space where the 14th boy lay. "You can leave this place now, Elias," Arthur said gently. "The job is done. The foundation is broken. You don't have to be the jailer anymore." Elias shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the pine box. "Gault isn't gone, Mr. Penelagon. You dug up the boys, but you didn't dig up the school. The mortar got the walls. The whole place is built on what he did. I can't leave. If I leave, who will make sure the weeds don't grow over the stones? Who will tell the truth when the magistrate's report becomes history?" Arthur realized then that there were 2 types of victims at St. Jude's: those who died standing up, and those who were forced to live on their knees, carrying the weight of the memory. The funeral took place on a Tuesday morning under a sky that threatened snow. It was not sanctioned by the church. The vicar had pleaded a scheduling conflict, a polite fiction that fooled no one. The ground at the edge of the cemetery, the pauper's unconsecrated strip, was rocky and overgrown with nettles. Arthur had paid extra for the gravediggers to clear it, but the earth still looked wounded. There were no mourners from the village. The townspeople stayed behind their curtains, unwilling to acknowledge the 14 scandals returning to the soil. The congregation consisted of 4 men: Arthur Penelagon, Dr. Silas Vance, Elias Thorne, and the foreman of the demolition crew, who stood awkwardly holding his cap, feeling the weight of the work he had done. Arthur read the names. He didn't read prayers. Gault had used prayers as weapons, and it felt profane to use them now. Instead, he read the facts. Thomas Miller, 12 years old, he held the line. Samuel Hines, 11 years old, he held the line. As each coffin was lowered, Elias threw a handful of the basement soil, the very earth they had been excavated from, onto the pine lids. It wasn't a gesture of dust to dust. It was a gesture of witness. You were here. You are still here. When the last grave was filled, the stone-cutter's work was revealed. 14 small granite headstones, set in a perfect military straight line. They were simple but deep cut, ensuring the names would outlast the weather. "It's done," Dr. Vance said, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "They are at rest." "Are they?" Elias asked. He was staring at the school on the hill, its dark windows like empty sockets watching them. The building is still there. The ledger is still in the office. The tube is still in the wall. Arthur looked at Elias. The man had changed in the last few days. The terrified, broken survivor was hardening into something else. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a guardian. "What will you do, Elias?" Arthur asked. "I'm going to fix the cottage," Elias said, his voice steady. "I'm going to clear the briars from the path. And when people come, and they will come, Mr. Penelagon, curiosity is stronger than shame. I'm going to tell them. I'm going to tell them about the boots, about the marbles, about the concrete. They won't want to hear it," Arthur warned. "They'll call you mad. They'll try to drive you out." "Let them try," Elias said, touching the cold granite of Thomas Miller's stone. "I stood in the wet cement with these boys. I packed it down with my own hands. I didn't move then, and I'm not moving now." Arthur realized he was looking at the 15th monument. Elias Thorne had become a living headstone, etched with a story that the town desperately wanted to erode. The scandal of 1924 eventually faded, buried under the sediment of the Great Depression and a Second World War. Arthur Penelagon moved south, though a check arrived at the local post office every December to cover the costs of maintenance. St. Jude stood empty for 3 decades, a rotting carcass on the hill, too cursed to repurpose and too sturdy to collapse. Elias Thorne kept his word. He became a specter of the estate, known only as a local eccentric to the village children, who dared each other to run past the rusted gates. He cleared the briars. He scrubbed the lichen from the 14 granite markers. And when hikers strayed onto the property, he told them the truth. He told them about the wet lime, the listening tube, and the marble. Most hurried away, unsettled by the intensity of the man with the concrete-colored hands. They preferred the safe thrill of a ghost story to the heavy, suffocating reality of industrial murder. In 1958, the county council finally condemned the structure. The land was to be zoned for grazing. The demolition crew arrived in early spring, the wrecking ball swinging like a pendulum against the gray sky. Elias, now 71, and bent like a wind-twisted hawthorn tree, met them at the perimeter. He didn't carry a shotgun or a protest sign. He carried a deed. It was a crumbling document, notarized in 1925. Arthur Penelagon had purchased a specific parcel of the property, the 2,000 square feet of the North Assembly Hall basement foundation. He had transferred the title to Elias Thorne for the sum of 1 shilling. "You can take the walls," Elias told the baffled site manager, his voice raspy but unbreakable. "You can take the roof. You can grind the bricks to dust, but the floor is mine. The floor stays." The demolition took 6 weeks. Elias watched from his cottage window as the tower fell. He watched the dormitory crumble. He watched the office where Gault had sat and listened vanish into a cloud of red dust. The monster was dismantled, brick by brick. But when the trucks hauled the debris away, a scar remained. The concrete slab of the basement foundation lay exposed to the sky, a flat, gray platform in the middle of the green moors. It was a stage without a theater. On the final day, after the machines had left, Elias walked out onto the slab. He found the trench line filled in now with fresh cement, but still visible as a seam in the stone. He walked the length of it, his footsteps echoing on the hard surface. He wasn't guarding a building anymore. He was guarding the footprint of the trauma. He brought his wooden chair out and placed it exactly where Thomas Miller had stood. He sat there as the sun went down, an old man on a concrete raft in a sea of heather. He realized then that Gault had been wrong about one thing. The foundation hadn't been built on the boys. The boys were the foundation. And now, stripped of the walls that had imprisoned them, they were finally the only thing left standing. The concrete slab is gone now. It eventually cracked, succumbed to the frost heave of the moors, and was swallowed by the heather and the gorse. If you walk to the coordinates today, you will find only a square depression in the earth, a geometric ghost where the grass grows a shade darker than the surrounding hills. Hikers call it the cold patch. They say that snow refuses to settle there, blown away by a wind that seems to rise from the ground itself. Arthur Peneligan's collection, the ledger, the photographs, the pocket diary resides in the basement of the county museum, stored in a box labeled Local Industrial History, Miscellaneous. The curator rarely opens it. The ink on the absconded stamps has faded to a illegible brown, and the leather of the diary has turned to dust. The horror of 1899 has been filed away, sanitized by the bureaucracy of archiving. But the marble remains. It sits in a small glass display case on the second floor, labeled simply, Glass Marble, circa 1900, recovered from St. Jude's excavation, 1924. Visitors walk past it every day. They glance at the chipped glass, perhaps wondering why a piece of trash is lit so carefully. They do not know it was the anchor that held a 12-year-old boy to the earth while he burned. They do not know it was the only weapon Thomas Miller had against a world that wanted to erase him. And at the edge of the village cemetery, the line holds. The 14 granite markers have weathered gray, their edges softened by a century of rain. Moss has filled the deep cuts of the names, turning Thomas Miller and William Graham into soft green inscriptions. The nettles fight to reclaim the ground, but the stones remain upright. They have not leaned. They have not shifted. They stand in that perfect military straight row, just as the boys once stood in the basement. Elias Thorne died in 1963. He was buried, by his own request, just outside the cemetery wall, perpendicular to the row. He is the sentry at the gate, the eternal witness guarding the regiment. The story of St. Jude's is no longer a scandal. It is a quiet, uncomfortable truth stitched into the landscape. It is a reminder that the most terrifying horrors are not the ones that hide in the dark, but the ones that are built in the daylight, sanctioned by ledgers, and poured into the very foundations of our institutions. Reverend Gault wanted to build a school on a foundation of discipline. He failed. He built it on a foundation of defiance. He thought he was burying 14 problems, but he was planting 14 seeds. And though the school is gone, and the walls have fallen, and the world has moved on, the boys are still standing. They are still holding the line.